Hi, this is Pat Johnson, and this is Psych 150, and in this mini lecture we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is the covering of the cerebrum. Cortex is a word that means the outer covering, the outer surface, and so the cerebral cortex is that outer covering of the cerebrum, and that's where most of the neurons in your brain are located. So if we look at your brain, and again, here's a human brain over here, just to review, this would be your brainstem. Right here, this would be your cerebellum, and all of this, all the wrinkled part, is your cerebrum. And the cerebral cortex is the top wrinkled part of your brain, that outer covering of the cerebrum, and it's located covering the top two, or the two cerebral hemispheres. The function of the cerebral cortex is it's the thinking part of your brain. It performs the higher functions, the higher order functions. So what we call the executive functions, logic, reason, planning, seeing consequences to behavior, motivation. All of those are the functions of the cerebral cortex. Now, why are there wrinkles in the cerebral cortex? This is a case where wrinkles are good, and so let me do a little bit of demonstration. All right, so here is a sheet of newspaper, and the sheet of newspaper is large. It's all double size sheet of newspaper, and if I was to go like this, I would have the same amount of newspaper in a very small area. And that's kind of what your brain does when it has folds on it. What is happening here is that the surface area of your brain is compacted into a really small little area. And I've asked my seated classes, why do you think that is? And they said, well, we look better. But no, that's not the reason. If we had a smooth cerebrum, if we had the same amount of surface space on the cerebral cortex, our brains would be huge. But the problem would be is that our mothers would not be able to give birth to us. We need to be able to get out of that birth canal with a very small skull to pass through the birth canal, but still have incredibly large and sophisticated cerebral cortex. So that's why there's so many wrinkles. It's actually folded in on itself so that there's a lot of surface area in a very compact space. Okay, so let's go to our next slide and talk about the two hemispheres. So your whole cerebrum has two hemispheres, and this is looking at the brain head on. So your eyes would be in front of here. This would be the back of your brain where you see the cerebellum and the brainstem coming down. So this would be your left hemisphere, and this would be your right hemisphere over here. So we have two hemispheres on our brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Now this is a side view of the brain. We're looking at just one side of the brain, and there are 4 lobes in each hemisphere of the brain. So 2 hemispheres and 4 lobes in each hemisphere. Right at the front, right here on each side of your brain, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, we have the frontal lobe. And really, that's what makes us, one of the things that makes us human is this incredibly huge frontal lobe that is not fully formed until we're into our 20s. And the frontal lobe deals with thought and planning and movement, and especially that prefrontal cortex here, seeing consequences to behavior. So the frontal lobe is really that part of the brain that does a lot of the thinking. And again, it's only fully formed until we're into our 20s. So if you've ever done anything stupid when you were a teenager and your parents said, "What were you thinking?" you could say, "Well, Mom, well, Dad, I just didn't have my frontal lobe fully formed yet because I'm not into my 20s. And then they'll probably get even more angry at you. All right, let's go on to the side. It's called the temporal lobe, and that's a good name for it because it's right along our temple here by our ear, and along the temple by our ear is a good way to remember its functions, because one of the things that the temporal lobe does is it processes hearing information. And we'll learn about the hippocampus. The hippocampus goes into the temporal lobe, and it deals with memory. Back at the back of the brain, right above the cerebellum would be down here. So right at the back of the brain is the occipital lobe, and that word occipital kind of reminds me of the word optic. And occipital lobe deals with vision. It processes visual information. So while your eyes are at the front of your head, that information is going to go down the optic nerve. One of the regions it's going to go to is the thalamus. The thalamus is dead center, and that would be interior. And then it would relay that information to the occipital lobe, where visual information is processed. The parietal, this is always the one that students can't remember on tests. It's the hardest one to remember. It's just kind of a weird word. The parietal lobe deals with touch and spatial relations. So in other words, by touch we mean skin senses, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So 4 lobes on each hemisphere: frontal lobe in the front, temporal lobe along the side, occipital lobe in the back. Remember that because Mom had eyes in the back of her head, and occipital lobe deals with vision, and then the parietal lobe towards the top back of the brain. All right, now this one shows 2 areas, and let's get our pen here. There is a deep fold between the frontal lobe, so all of this would be frontal lobe, and the parietal lobe. All of this would be parietal lobe. Okay, so there's a deep fold right here. Right in front of that deep fold is what we call the motor cortex. So the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe, and it's right in front of that deep fold that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So here's the motor cortex. Again, it's in the frontal lobe. It's right in front of that deep fold that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Motor. Now the word motor means movement. Okay, so what is being done in the motor cortex of the frontal lobe is that voluntary movement that we have. So if you were to move your hand, if you were to move your lips, if you were to move your feet, all of that comes from the motor cortex right here. Somatosensory, so the word soma is just a word that means body. And so when we're talking about somatosensory, we're talking about body or skin senses. So things like pain, if your hand was to get pinched in a car door, pressure, hot, cold, anything that your skin can sense is processed here in the somatosensory area. So motor, in other words, movement here, and skin senses here. Now, how are you going to remember that? Which lobe the motor cortex is? Well, just remember that the motor is usually, not always, but the motor is usually in the front of a car. So the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe. And again, this is the frontal lobe here. And then the parietal lobe, or the somatosensory cortex, is in the parietal lobe. Now this is one of my favorite slides, and let me get my face out of here. This is one of my favorite slides because, again, it's showing the motor cortex and the sensory or the somatosensory cortex, but then it's pulled it out of the brain and has these body parts hanging out around. And what's cool about this is it's showing where on the motor cortex your toes are controlled. In other words, where you have movement on your toes is in this fold going down into the lower into the brain. And your knees and your trunk and your arms and your wrist and your fingers and then your face. So we have face up here. We have your hands, your fingers here, and then your legs going down into that fold in the center of the brain, the center sulcus. And that means that actually you're upside down on your brain because your legs are controlled at the top and your face is controlled more down at the side. Now, the other thing I want you to take a look at is these body parts are different sizes. The face is really big, the hand is really big, the trunk, the legs, the toes are small. And what the artist is showing here is the relative proportion of motor cortex dedicated to these body parts. Let me say that again. These body parts are drawn in different sizes with a really big face, especially big lips and a big tongue and a big thumb and big fingers to show you what proportion of the motor cortex is dedicated to those body parts. So think about the body parts you have really fine muscle control of. Right now I'm speaking precisely because I'm moving my lips and my tongue in very precise coordinated movements. And I can only do that because there's a whole lot of my motor cortex dedicated to just my mouth and my tongue. I can also move my hands, my fingers, especially my thumb, in a very detailed, very fine motor movements because I can move those very, very precisely because there's a lot of motor cortex dedicated to them. Same over here on our sensory cortex, our somatosensory cortex. Think about those parts of your brain that have that are very sensitive to touch. Again, if you've ever had dental pain, if you've ever smashed your finger or your foot in a car door, you know those are really sensitive, and that's because there's a lot of space on the sensory cortex dedicated to nerve endings in those, processing information from the nerve endings in those body parts. Now, if you notice over here, we have something that is not over here. We have genitals. So our genitals feel a lot of sensation. In other words, there's a lot of skin sense there, but we don't have motor movement control over our genitals. So we have again down here, we have our skin senses for our genitals, legs, trunk, hand, face, tongue, and that's showing how sensitive those body parts are. So again, motor cortex located in the frontal lobe, right before that deep fold. Here's the here's the somatosensory cortex located in the parietal lobe. And this is the parietal lobe here. So that's the cerebral cortexes. 2 cerebral hemispheres, 4 lobes in each hemisphere. The motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe. The somatosensory cortex is located in the parietal lobe.